Hi everybody, today we are replacing the fuel line in a Stihl MS290 Farm Boss chainsaw. I'm replacing my fuel line because I had a crack in it, and when I tried to pull off my fuel filter, which this is a replacement fuel filter, this bell housing cracked. So the entire unit has to be replaced. It was about 20 bucks. You can only really get it from a Stihl dealer, and it only works with a Stihl part. Generic fuel lines, knockoff fuel lines, I do not recommend at all. Going through some of our parts of the fuel line. Like I said before, here's the bell end that goes into our fuel filter. This S-bend is what is flexible inside the tank so that that fuel filter with its weight on the end can get to the lowest point in the fuel tank. This is the bulkhead connector on the top of the fuel tank that will create this seal between the fuel tank and the carburetor housing, or the carburetor area where this part sits. And then this tip is what slips onto our carburetor. All right, the back of the chainsaw here, we have our air cleaner housing. We're going to take that off. Inside we have our air cleaner and thermal gate, I guess you could call it. It's a winter-summer mode. Here in New Jersey, it just runs in summer mode all the time. I never really get cold enough to use it in the winter. Here's our air filter. This is a replacement air filter I picked up recently. It is an upgrade from the factory one that I received with this saw about 10 years ago. And we got to take that off with a slotted driver, get to our carburetor underneath. All right, here's our carburetor. Here's our main inlet, retaining studs. You can see the throttle controls on the bottom here. That gate in the front's the choke. Won't operate right now, but that's because I don't use two hands to do this. And then this is a bypass air inlet that actually goes into the back of the air filter here. I believe that pulls in auxiliary air. So we have to remove the carburetor, unclip the throttle cable, be able to pull it out to access our fuel line. Before I forget, this connector here has kind of some sort of breather on the bottom. I think that's the crankcase breather. Or, I'm sorry, not a crankcase breather, a fuel tank vent breather. Come around to this side, that's our throttle adjustments. So these tubes are rubber, but they're just kind of to keep all the gunk away from the carburetor assembly while you're working. Going to use an 8mm nut driver and just pull off the carburetor retainer nuts. All right, carburetor retainer nuts are off. Just going to pull the entire carburetor out. Oh, pull an adapter plate off. Pull that off now so I don't lose it later. And I think it just takes a little bit of convincing to pull this carburetor out, and probably two hands. Got to pull the rubber throttle boot out, or throttle adjustment boot. There we go, we'll get that guy out of the way. And we'll pull this off with two hands. All right, we're going to go back one step and disconnect the throttle linkage. Get to the throttle linkage by depressing the grip safety and opening up the trigger grip, and we can see our throttle cable is held in place, just clipped into that plastic bit there. We're going to pop that out of the way and disconnect it from our carburetor, which our disconnect is down there, and we'll be able to pull everything out. All right, and you can just about see slightly out of focus in the center of the screen behind this spring is where the throttle cable connects. I can just take this throttle linkage, rotate it counterclockwise, and disconnect it. All right, so the carburetor's out. Here's our fuel line. Fuel line came in protected under this little housing, and on the carburetor, connected right there. We have another line on the bottom of the carburetor here, and I think that this is the purge return. That's right on the back there. I believe that goes into the fuel tank. So that actually is pretty easy to slip on. Looks like the fuel line will have to be slipped on before the carburetor is put on these mounting studs. Look a little bit back in. You can kind of see that bulkhead connector on the bottom. That's the top of the fuel tank there. That's a little bit out of focus. There we go. So that's the top of our fuel tank there with our bulkhead connector that we're going to put our new fuel line in. All right, used a pair of pliers to pull up on the fuel line, popped it out of the fuel tank at the bulkhead connector. You can see there's this little dimple that faces the throttle control when you put this back together. So we just pull that out. We'll get the old fuel line out, put the new fuel line in. Remember, the fuel filter is going to go on after this line is in the carburetor. All right, here's the side-by-side comparison. New fuel line versus the old fuel line. New fuel line is on the left. Old fuel line is on the right. You can see right where that bell housing ripped off the fuel line. And you can see this little dimple. It's going to face towards our throttle control. That's also there. And the lengths look right. So I'd say it's the right part. Should be, especially since I got it from the Stihl dealer. All right, well, I wound up using a pair of long needle nose pliers to pull the fuel line into the tank. Couldn't really push it in. That bulkhead connector is kind of like a grommet. Has a tapered seat to it, so it does go in. And just a little easy pressure, pulled it on in. Very, very simple. No breaks or tears, and it's nice new rubber hose. So we're going to start the reassembly. We're going to start with putting the fuel line onto the carburetor first. Slip the carburetor onto the mounting studs. Make sure it lines up with this return line here. Then we're going to take this ventilation line, loop it over the carburetor, and put our boots in place. Ooh, got to clean that out. All right, starting with the fuel line in place. Just slip that onto those two mounting studs. Get everything to nicely line up. See our line down there. Oh, I'm sorry, it's out of focus. Everything's going to line up down there. You see our fuel line's kind of protected by the shroud. And we'll line up all this. All right, got these rubber tubes back in place with that ventilation unit. Push that back in. I think we're nice and tight to the back. And we'll get our throttle cable back in place first before putting these nuts in place. That way, if we have to make any adjustments or pull it back a little bit, we're not restricted. When you're putting that throttle cable back in place on the trigger assembly on this plastic clip, make sure it clips in place. Otherwise, it'll just sit here loose. And you can see it's popping off now. So make sure it clips in place. Just like that. All right, everything's back in place. Remember to get that flange in there. Get our air filter back in place. And take it for a test run. Hope this helps, everybody. Thanks for watching.